Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. This is the last one in a four-part series, so I'm very excited to be here at the end with a couple great speakers to round out our series. My name is Rebecca Anger. I'm AASHTO's Program Manager for Transit Policy and Technical Assistance at AASHTO. At AASHTO, I support our Council on Public Transportation, our associated technical service program called AASHTO Transit Management, and then our council-sponsored intercommittee working group on shared mobility, mobility on demand, and mobility as a service. It's through this intercommittee working group that AASHTO and SUMC have come to partner on today's workshop series. So without further ado, I'm very excited to jump into things, and I would like to hand things off to Colin to say hello and introduce today's speakers for what I am looking forward to as a very interactive questions welcome at all times sort of webinar. So Colin.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to AASHTO for having us. And thanks for joining us, Tiffany and Brennan. My name is Colin Murphy. I'm the Director of Research and Consulting at the Shared Use Mobility Center. I'm out of Chicago myself, but SUMC works all over the country. We're a national nonprofit that works at the intersection of public transit and new shared mobility like bike sharing, car sharing, microtransit, the subject of the webinar today. We do research, we connect practitioners with information and resources, and we provide technical assistance and capacity building for agencies all over the country. A lot of the impetus for this work and this workshop series for AASHTO came out of our working with grantees of the Federal Transit Administration's Transit Innovation Demonstration Programs. So you might have heard of the Mobility on Demand Sandbox, AIM, IMI, those programs. So this work included a number of state DOTs who were doing interesting kind of groundbreaking work in finding new ways to deliver transit service, coordinate services across agencies, or just generally provide broader access and new technologies to users. So that's what this is kind of all about. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So today's workshop is on microtransit, or kind of smaller demand responsive transit services, with a focus especially on statewide microtransit programs that build access for people in smaller towns and rural areas. And this is building on some of the topics covered in the earlier workshops in the series, which are on the screen right now. So these took a look at various technological innovations in transit, ways different state DOTs are supporting some of these innovations and improvements. So we looked at data standards, trip planning apps, multimodal payment solutions. And this is the last workshop in the current series. We're working on sort of the next phase coming up. We're still planning that. But recordings and summaries of all the workshops will be made available to you as we get them ready. The recordings will be available to AASHTO members only, but already the summaries are available on SUMC's Mobility Learning Center. There's a short link there, and we'll drop the full link in the chat. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Tiffany Dubinsky is the Director of Transit Planning at the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. And Brennan Fuqua is the Director of North Carolina DOT's Integrated Mobility Division. So they're each going to do their presentations, and then after that, we're going to a Q&A session and just general discussion. So at any point in the presentations, feel free to drop questions into the chat as they occur to you, and then we'll address those in the Q&A session. Or if you prefer to wait until if you want to actually get on camera and talk, that's fine. So once we're in the Q&A session, just go ahead and click the raise hand button, and we will call on you to come off mute and ask questions directly. So now, without further ado, let's get into the presentations. And first is Tiffany from Virginia. Take it away, Tiffany.
Thank you so much, Colin, and thank you to AASHTO and SUMC and FTA for inviting me to speak today and sound like I know what I'm doing when I'm talking about microtransit. So as mentioned, I am the Director of Transit Planning for the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. we'll call ourselves DRPT, so I could save myself a couple of breaths. But really today, I really wanted to emphasize about how we in Virginia, over my time here, roughly about 7.5, 8 years, have really explored how to support mobility solutions, demonstration, innovative transportation solutions in particular. But honestly, within the last 3 to 4 years, we have had a strong interest in implementation on microtransit. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've done in terms of kind of developing a pipeline, especially for our smaller agencies and rural agencies, our 5311s, to really kind of help subsidize each step of the way from planning to implementation, to help them kind of explore what's the right size solution for them when it comes to thinking about their service models in their areas. Next slide, please. So what's helpful in this discussion is talking about some of our state programs. I guess I will preface a little bit with DRPT that we are unique in Virginia, that we are not attached directly to our state DOT. So I know a number of our state DOTs, public transportation and rail, are nested usually under a department of the DOT. But we are actually our own sister agency to the Virginia DOT in the state. So we manage mostly freight rail at this point, public transportation, and commuter assistance programs. Part of our responsibilities is also managing a number of state grant programs. So in addition to what we do with capital and operating assistance, we also have what we kind of term our special programs, and the list is provided here. These are all relevant because they have all helped in some fashion for our grantees, whether they're transit agencies or localities, even MPOs and PDCs, truly to kind of explore feasibility of looking at mobility as a service or mobility on demand and microtransit, all the way through to helping them deploy some pilot projects, and then thinking about the long-term sustainability, which is really kind of the last part that we're still learning more here in Virginia, is that how do we keep some of these microtransit projects moving forward, even when they're successful or not. So next slide. So I just want to highlight some of the programs and what we have done. So first, starting with workforce development. This is more applicable just in terms of the whole industry, but we do highlight this because in addition to actually getting vehicles and actually having operating the software and so forth, having actual staff who not only know how to navigate the different software and applications, but also to maintain your vehicles and understand how to do the dynamic ride matching in microtransit. That component is something that's always been something that's overlooked when we've seen a number of projects come through from our grantees. So I always highlight first that there is a workforce development program. We've also seen this used in terms of planning and scheduling. We've used this as well for even certifications. So some of our agencies have helped use this grant to develop their own in-house CDL programs that have been helpful as well. So I just wanted to highlight this. In particular, we have match rates where we have said that we provide up to 80% state funding, and then there's a local match of up to 20% here. Next slide. This is kind of where we start seeing that natural connection of microtransit. So a lot of transit agencies or PDCs, localities say that they would love to learn more about whether or not something would make sense and what's the feasible solution. So technical assistance is where we see all of our planning activities. So any kind of studies, technical evaluations, this is also supportive of a lot of state and federal requirements. So this can be related to transit asset management or public transportation agency safety plans. We also require from our state transit agencies, transit development plans or strategic plans, which is roughly like a 10-year planning horizon document, very similar to MPO's long-range plans. And then for our commuter assistance programs, they also have strategic plans as well as TDM plans that they can apply, and they're eligible for up to 50% state funding on this. So I mention this because a lot of times we get a lot of concepts and ideas about projects, and they don't really have a full scope of work related to how long is it going to run, what kind of service areas, the number of vehicles, even the cost that are baked into it. They don't always have a great foundation for what would be a demonstration project. So the technical assistance is usually where I encourage a lot of our transit agencies and partners to come in first to just make sure that it is the right solution for them and that they have everything prepared for when they're ready to deploy. Next slide. Here's where we started seeing a lot of our microtransit projects come in initially, which is demonstration. This has been a program that we've run for many years, and it used to be just geared towards new transit service. So if there was a new express route or a commuter route, mostly fixed route service in areas that did not have any kind of previous service introduced. But as we've seen technology and service models change, there was an interest to expand this. And so we did this where we had additional types that would be classified as kind of innovation and technology. So we've funded a number of projects that have fallen into this category that wasn't cleanly new transit service. I always make a note about this is that, this is usually only for 12 to 18 months. It's not meant to be a long-term funding source to be able to test out some of these proof of concepts. We provide up to 80% state match, and this can include operating some capital, so we don't cover vehicles, but if there's some infrastructure related to any kind of bus signage or even some landing pads, we have made that eligible through our program here. And then there's a 20% local match. We make sure in this particular instance that applicants have to have the authority to run the service, because we have had a number of applications come in where people say they would love to run the service, but then they don't actually have local support. And so that has ended up being projects that are dead on arrival. Next slide. And just to kind of emphasize again how we have split our program. So where we see with microtransit or just mobility on demand services is kind of in between right now, where we're seeing it really is a new transit service in a lot of situations, but we're still testing the proof of concept of what are the ideal conditions of where microtransit would run in at least the Commonwealth. Is it going to be more urban, rural, low, high density? Is it something that in terms of use cases, it would support connecting to first mile, last mile connections, or overlay to be able to help with some underperforming fixed route. So we right now still classify as type 2, where it's testing this proof of concept. It could be anything from full turnkey service all the way to just acquisition of the actual technology or software. We do always make this distinction that this is not for any solutions that have been deployed for years. So if you were applying for CAD AVL, obviously that has been out for quite long enough that you don't need to test any more proof of concept with those different types of technology solutions. Next slide. The last kind of program that I would like to highlight that we provide some support when it comes to microtransit or mobility projects. Back in 2020, Virginia, as part of our omnibus bill, launched what we call our Transit Ridership Incentive Program. It started off roughly with 2 distinct program goals that focused on regional connectivity and zero fare. We introduced in the last fiscal year 24, I should say, 2 additional programs, but have more of a capital component supporting public safety and passenger amenities. But what's important is that we saw that there is this next step after going through demonstration of that some of our larger agencies in particular saw that there was an opportunity to pursue under regional connectivity. And so next slide, you'll see that we talk a little bit about regional connectivity and how this was something that we funded multiple microtransit projects. I know the lens today is maybe is a little bit more of an interest for our smaller rural areas as well, because our larger agencies already have a lot of the resources to do microtransit. But as the 2020 census proved, that urbanized areas are currently expanding and changing, and creative partnerships between urban and rural areas kind of allowed some microtransit projects to come through under this program. So I highlight this because this has been a new state funding program that we've been able to provide some microtransit funding for our agencies. And the funding is a step-down approach, but it covers roughly 4 years of step-down funding, and then the 5th year is fully on the grantee to demonstrate that they can sustain the service if they choose to prove or continue it after the state funding is done. Next slide. And this slide here is about zero fare and low income. And so the reason I just want to highlight this is because some of our microtransit pilots have also been tied to zero fare or having some subsidized fare program. And we're still looking through whether or not that has had an impact on the success of the microtransit pilot. But that has been a major consideration in terms of how to charge fares, or if you're charging fares and deploying microtransit solutions for our transit providers. Next slide. So Just highlight this as before I go into some of our major projects that we have funded here in Virginia. We've over the last few years kind of developed what I call is like a pipeline for new service. And in particular, this really supports microtransit. So as an interested locality or a transit agency, they apply for technical assistance. They go through a microtransit or a transit feasibility study because as I always say, microtransit is not the only solution. You just need to find the right one for you. And through that study, you'll be able to identify the right recommendation to develop a pilot and then apply for that through our program. And if funded, we support a demonstration pilot that can be anywhere from 18 months up to 24, depending on the scope. And if it applies, then you can also then move forward to TRIP. So ultimately, if you're thinking through, depending on where you are in the Commonwealth, there is a potential that we can help subsidize what would be a demonstration pilot for roughly about 5-6 years, depending on what you're able to provide in local match and actually operate. And I think that is something that is a very big advantage for a lot of agencies who understand the risks that may come into play for microtransit or the need. And when I go over some of our example projects, some of them launched during COVID. So having the ability to perhaps pursue or have funding that was for more than maybe a year was in their benefit because we all know what happened with COVID and the impacts on service. But ultimately, what we aim for is that having enough data, having enough demand that's built and demonstrated through these projects helps our agencies then transition this into regular operations. And I'll touch a little bit when I talk about some of these projects, but in particular, when we're talking about our rural agencies or those who are 5311 recipients, we're now trying to figure out how much are we encouraging these expansion of services, especially with how nimble microtransit or mobility on demand solutions can be, and then where we are with our current federal funding and what we can do at the state funding levels to help support that. So next slide. Here's kind of our list of really microtransit projects that we have deployed throughout Virginia. I'm sorry I didn't have an illustrative map, but it really kind of covers the full breadth of Virginia. But in particular, it's been a range of geographic areas. So anywhere from like more small urban university towns up to the capital. So here in Richmond, where I'm based, we've also seen more in our rural counties, especially down in Southwest Virginia, which I'll talk a little bit more in a couple slides. But needless to say, we haven't found what's that sweet spot in terms of what's successful. And so we're seeing everyone explore it. So even now in Northern Virginia, we're seeing a lot more microtransit interest, especially post-COVID and with the travel changes, the federal return to work and changes in kind of commute patterns in general. A lot of our Northern Virginia agencies have started exploring microtransit to be sort of complementary to either the metro service or their own kind of fixed route service. So next slide, please. I'll start first touching in on the GLTC microtransit pilot. So we deployed a study with them back in 2022. And this was with Lynchburg in particular, and this is kind of a smaller city. It's based with Liberty University, and they were trying to look at really kind of zones that could look and be of interest for them in terms of deployments here. GLTC finished that study and applied for a demonstration as well as a TRIP grant because they were eligible in 2023. But we encouraged them to combine both the service zones in there. And it did launch actually about late 2024 for the pilot. So it's now called GLTC Flex, and it operates within the city of Lynchburg, and it'll have roughly about 1.5 to 2-year pilot zone. Next slide. The other one I kind of wanted to talk about here is what we had termed our Virginia Rural Microtransit Deployment Initiative. Colin mentioned that SUMC got introduced to a number of us through some of the FTA programs that they had done some projects through. We were lucky enough to receive the IMI grant, and in addition to getting some funds from our state's Innovation Technology Transportation Fund, we were able to test really the concept of doing microtransit within rural areas. So for us, we focused on acquiring software as a service, and we were able to identify 2 agencies on either side of the state, one that's located in Wise, Virginia, so that's going to be MEOC, and I'll touch on their service in a bit. And then the other was on Bay Transit, that's based in Gloucester, Virginia, on the east part of the state. So next slide. So for Bay Transit, it was helpful just kind of to be able to explain where they are. They are predominantly a demand response, majority rural service provider, and they have also 2 deviate fixed route lines that they operate currently. They launched their microtransit service, the IMI grant, in June 28th, 2021. I will say that the experience of doing the procurement through Bay as well as MEOC through this grant was a challenge for us as a state DOT because we had a lot of hurdles with our state IT, as well as just kind of being able to understand with our general procurement and services division of the state what we were going through. And so we had to change the procurement in order to meet the timelines of the grant and have one of our transit agencies, in particular Bay Transit, do the procurement directly to choose VIA in this case to be able to deploy this actual service.
Except for the
So this started in 2021, and it proved to be so successful that Bay Transit ended up applying for a demonstration grant in 2022 to expand it. And this allowed them, in particular in the use case, they were able to replace one of their deviate fixed routes, which was their Hive Express, to be fully microtransit in the zone. And when I show the map with the service zone, it'll make a little bit more sense. The demonstration project then started in 2022. It actually is still running. They did an additional year and some expansion for their zones. So they now are running, I think, roughly about 3 service zones for microtransit with plans to continue that expansion over the next few years. Next slide. This gives you an idea of kind of really what they started out with on the left. This was their initial service zone. You can see, and I think the overlying joke that all of us in terms of state DOTs and microtransit say is that you're a successful microtransit if you have a Walmart somewhere in your service zone. And so that has proven to be the case for a lot of our projects. Bay Transit in particular, their service, the Hive Express ran through this as a corridor, and so they overlaid microtransit to help with the deviated fixed route. But they found that as the general ridership became more aware, became more popular, they had to expand. So about maybe 6 months into the project, they ended up changing the service zone. So as you see on the right, it actually is really I would almost classify it as 2 service zones with a connection between the zones, but it's one long corridor that now is kind of their service zone. As I mentioned, this was kind of what the model was, but then they have now completely gone microtransit and removed the Hive Express because everyone was choosing the microtransit service over the deviated fixed route. Next slide. And then lastly, I just kind of want to touch base on the other project that we did, which was MetGo. So that was Mountain Empire Older Citizens. They are located in, as I mentioned, Southwest Virginia, service for counties of Lee, Scott, Wise, City of Norton. They ran just demand response service, very much a small, low density option. They launched roughly on the same week, if not the same day as Bay Transit did. But the distinction I always make is important is that they also currently operate fare free. They received a trip grant under that zero fare grant that program that I mentioned earlier, and their service has gotten a lot of coverage and has been wildly successful. They applied for a demonstration grant to expand the service, so they now run, I think it's still just 2 as of right now, and they continue to plan in terms of expansion to other service areas. And I always like highlighting this photo here because it's one of our best photos of some of our staff with the Mountain Empire staff cutting the ribbon from the ribbon launching there. Next slide. And then the same idea, like the way that it had kind of expanded and from what it was initially. Mountain Empire originally had theirs, again, there you see the Walmart. They found that for them, a lot of people were willing to walk a mile and a half outside of the service zone and end up being in the applicable area in order to get the service. So on the right, they did some modifications to be able to capture where they were seeing a lot of their riders coming in and where they could while maintaining roughly about a 10 to 15 minute trip time for their services. So I pointed out these examples, one about kind of where the demand and also the flexibility we were able to demonstrate with microtransit. Next slide. So I only had a short amount of time, but we did provide some resources. Most importantly was kind of this one tool here, which was looking at the results of doing these microtransit pilots with Bay Transit and Mountain Empire. And this also gives a little bit of some kind of like a suitability checklist and an implementation toolkit. I forgot to put in my slides here. We also did a sort of a transit technology procurement document that was aimed both at AME scheduling software and microtransit. Both obviously are going to be lensed towards the rural agencies or rural areas, but I think that if you are trying to embark and think through what you're thinking through of what microtransit would look like and service models and everything, the checklist, as well as some examples of what should be used for microtransit, these documents are very helpful. So this is available on their DRPT website, but if you hit the last slide, you can always reach out to me and I'd be glad to be able to answer questions, be able to talk about that and provide any other resources. So I think any last minute lessons learned: one, make sure your proposals for any microtransit service, you keep a cap on the page. We had pages that were almost 200 per proposal. Two is really having a good understanding of the procurement process as a state DOT. And then three, I mentioned in the beginning, but especially for our smaller and rural agencies, it's such a hard balance that we're finding right now of encouraging new transportation, expansion of service, but while figuring out how we are maintaining current operations at the funding levels we have. And with that, I will concede this and I'll be able to be glad to pass this back to Colin.
Thank you, Tiffany. That was great. And I'm going to check out that evaluation report right now. That was not on my radar before. So again, if you all have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll address them after the presentations are over. But now we will go to Brennan Fuqua from North Carolina DOT. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Colin. And thank you, everybody, for setting this up and having the opportunity to talk about what microtransit looks like in North Carolina. It's tough, but exciting to follow Tiffany and what they're doing up in Virginia. And so I think what I'm going to do is on this, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the technical assistance that we provide to our transit agencies. Again, kind of similar to Virginia, really focusing on the rural aspect of things and the successes that we've seen, but also the lessons learned as we go. So next slide, please. Just to kick us off, I like to kind of level set how we talk to our transit agencies or our local governments about what microtransit is. So next slide, just a really brief primer on what microtransit is. So we're talking about a technology-enabled on-demand service that will be similar to what you see with rideshare, common private rideshare services like Uber or Lyft. But we're talking about having them be subsidized. We have defined service zones when we're talking microtransit. As always, for it to be public transportation, we have the ability to share rides. And then the other very positive side of this is part of a transit agency that will have those professional drivers and dedicated vehicles to things there. And the way that we look at it in North Carolina is we want to make sure that this is a complement for our multimodal network, making sure that we're providing that connection piece to whatever their next mode of transportation is, whether that's pedestrian or finding a fixed route or whatever that happens next for their ride. Next slide, please. And so when we talk to somebody who's not familiar with what microtransit is, we really break it down into three buckets. And those are software as a service, blended model, and then their transportation as a service or turnkey services. They each have positives and advantages and potential challenges that come with them, obviously. Software as a service, the agencies will be able to buy that software and use it on their existing fleet. They will be able to have their existing drivers trained to utilize that. It lowers some of that upfront cost and ability, and it also gives you a little more flexibility when you're talking about service levels and quick changes to different hours of operations and things like that. And then on the opposite side of that, turnkey, the real advantage is that it's kind of you put it in place and then you monitor to make sure it's moving well, but you have a professional service coming in and providing you the drivers and the training and the ridership Some of the challenges that come with that, especially when you're talking about utilizing federal funds and 5311 funds, or even some of the state funds that we provide in North Carolina, you have to make sure that those vendors are compliant with things like the drug and alcohol requirements and your expectations for that. You also want to make sure that you have the correct contract set up in place so the data is finding the right balance of what's provided to you. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So next slide, please. And so when we talk about microtransit, especially as we're talking to new entities that are looking to set something up, what we're really looking to provide in North Carolina is a menu of items that we understand that every single agency is not going to be one size fits all when it comes to microtransit. But we want to talk them through what the process is for getting something set up so they can be as successful as possible. And as Tiffany mentioned, this is a learning process. This is all pretty new as we continue to develop it, and variables change and funding sources change and things like that. So we have to be adaptable as programs get up and running. But there's a couple of key considerations that we look at as a state agency when we're talking microtransit. And one of those is you have to understand what the funding source is going to be. We've been lucky, I guess is the right way to say, in North Carolina, or we've worked really hard to make sure that we're finding these discretionary grants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that to get something set up. And the process that we're really looking at and what we've been successful with is really getting these types of upfront funds and setting up a proof of concept, and then working through that to find those additional funding sources to make sure this is moving, continuing to move, whether that's local or additional state funds, or if there's any sort of third-party contracting that we can find to help facilitate these programs as they become popular and really entrenched into the communities. As I said before, when you are talking about contracting either with software or turnkey service, you really need to own your own data, because that's how you make sure that your program is being effective, or you need to adjust the level of service that's provided or the hours or any of those things. They really come with data, and you have to be very diligent when you're building out your contracts with vendors or anybody providing that service to make sure that that data is right sized for your needs. And then we want to talk about capacity and making sure that you have enough to support the agencies at a state level. Are we making sure that we're providing the same level of service as we go around? One thing that's a real advantage is making sure that we are doing a robust vendor search, that we're finding things that are working in other states or in other agencies across the state, and making sure that those resources are available when we're talking about setting things up. Tiffany brought up fair determination. How do you make sure that it makes sense and it works with your existing public transit network? And then the biggest thing, I think, is making sure that you're prepared to coordinate and making sure that you're talking to both your transit provider and the local municipalities and the planning organizations. When you can bring them all to the table, that's where we've seen the most success on projects. Next slide, please. So what is this? Why is NCDOT, why is IMD supporting this? And you can go to the next slide. Well, this is all the rage in North Carolina, and you can see some of the growth that we've had over the past couple of years in a few slides. But what we're seeing with microtransit is we're providing, or our agencies are providing, these flexible and convenient transportation options that's really giving consideration to folks that aren't using public transit currently to move throughout North Carolina utilizing microtransit because of the flexibility that it has, because of the subsidized costs. North Carolina has quite a few urban areas, especially along our central corridors, but the vast majority of our state is very rural, and we have over 1 million residents in North Carolina that don't have reliable access to a single occupancy vehicle. So any tool that we can add to the toolbox on providing public transportation to those is something that we're going to pursue. We look at microtransit in its best form as a connection to a additional public transportation opportunity. So connection to a fixed route or regional route if possible. And we've seen that in areas. We've also seen places where fixed route just wasn't working, whether it was the timing or the service hours that were provided. And microtransit becomes a really flexible way to do that, especially in an urban corridor. I mean, in an urban area where everything is spread out, uh, low density areas in particular. We've also seen flexibility in times. You can adjust your microtransit timing to calendar events. You can adjust it to when you see the most demand, outside of what you get on a traditional fixed route or even a traditional demand response that requires prior scheduling. And then obviously the convenience that you get outweighs demand response because of that scheduling opportunities. Now, you do have to balance prioritization, which is something that we're continuing to find and continuing to work on in North Carolina as well. Next slide. So where has this started in North Carolina? You can go to the next slide. Really, this started back in 2020, and like Virginia, our first couple of deployments were in COVID, and we were really worried about having funds come from the federal government and then trying to deploy a new transit operation in the middle of COVID when people weren't moving around as much. But what we saw and what's been one of the shining lights of microtransit has been what we've seen in Wilson, Orange County and Wilson especially as a rural community, is their ridership doubled in the midst of COVID, in the height of COVID, from what we were seeing from their fixed route service that was there before. And that's continued to grow, and people are noticing that in North Carolina. And so just to give you an idea of where we were, starting in 2020, we had the two come in. The next year in 2021, we had 4 microtransit agencies. Moving ahead to 2023, we had 9 transit agencies up and running with microtransit. And then moving into the next year of 2024, we had 11 revenue building microtransit agencies in 2024. And then I'll talk to you a little bit more about our Me&C mobility for everyone everywhere in North Carolina program that's looking to set up 10 additional microtransit programs throughout the state. So at the end of the year in 2025, we will have 21 revenue generating microtransit agents programs in North Carolina. And if you go to the next slide, you'll be able to see, and I apologize for the quality of this map. If you go on our website and look up microtransit and NCDOT, you'll be able to blow this up a little bit more. But as you can see, it's really statewide in the places that it's implemented. So you can see in the light green, our revenue generations, there's a lot of planning going on. Feasibility studies are a major aspect of us getting programs up and running. And then Me&C is the kind of dark blue teal color that's spread throughout the state as well. So getting all of these programs up and running and making sure that they have the tools that they need to be successful is really important for us in North Carolina. Next slide. Just to highlight a couple of these early initiators of microtransit, we have 3 that we wanted to represent here. The first one is YVETI, which is a multi-county transit agency that's along the Virginia border, kind of in the northwest of the state. And what they've done is they've done a kind of hybrid on-demand microtransit operation in a couple of different towns within the area. And this is a complete replacement of their fixed route service that was operating in these smaller towns, city centers, but not seeing a lot of ridership. And what this did was it really expanded the service area and the connection between individuals that weren't on the fixed routes to be able to utilize public transportation in one of our lower density areas of our state. On the flip side, we have a pilot program going on in RTP, which is our Research Triangle Park. This is the triangle area right in between Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. It is our economic driver of industry in North Carolina. You'll have IBM campus there, RTI, our major employers of the state operate in this, and that area is set up through Go Triangle, our local transit agency, a last mile connection version of a microtransit. So it is specifically set to take people between businesses and the local conveniences like restaurants and any of the service that they need within the area. And then the third one to highlight is a suburban area in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is where I'm at today. So it's kind of fortuitous that the presentation has this. And what they've done is they've set up their microtransit in multiple zones, and they have that connected by fixed route in the areas. So as you can see, there's very little overlap in the zoning there. The idea is that you take microtransit to a larger transit line like fixed route that can get you to another zone if that's where you need to go, or if you need to travel within your zone, it has that curb to curb capabilities. So next slide. With these early implementations, we had a lot of lessons learned, and some of those may be obvious, but it is something that we continue to use to build out what our structure and our framework looks like when we're talking to transit agencies that are interested in this. First off, similar to Virginia as well, feasibility studies go a long way. They help identify these variables and what could work in your community. And it looks at other like-sized communities in North Carolina. And it's a big advantage of ours that we have such a diverse amount of systems doing this. These feasibility studies can take those variables and apply them to your own area, and then also help you find some of those funding sources or identify some of those potential funding sources that are so important, not only to set this up as a pilot, but what does it look like in year 3, 4, 5? How do you make sure that you have what you need to expand or reduce service as necessary there? We want to make sure, as I said before, that everybody's talking to each other. If we have a county transit agency providing a service for a local municipality and that local municipality doesn't have a say in hours of operation or anything like that, it makes it a much more difficult conversation on, are they providing the right level of service? And then that gets into the funding conversations as well. We want to be able to make sure that people understand those service delivery models and the selection of service providers. There are several going on throughout the country, and there's some big players there, and there's advantages to some and disadvantages to the others. And it really just matters what the service you want to provide is for that. Another huge thing we saw was marketing. It was the key reason for Wilson's success was being able to get out into the community and really talk to those people who were reliant on public transportation, making sure they understood what microtransit was, what the technology was. If you didn't have access to a smartphone, how do you get rides on public transportation? All of these things, and really getting public buy-in was extremely important to success on things moving forward. And then we obviously got operational lessons on what works, how far is too far for a ride, how do you make sure that you're prioritizing rides that are essential, as opposed to everybody taking 1 mile rides at low or no costs, and then others folks that need to go to the hospital or to their jobs or things like that are not getting that right prioritization. And that's still something that's pretty difficult and pretty requires a little bit more research and tweaking as we go through setting these up. All right, and next slide. So now I want to take those lessons learned and tell you how we're implementing those with our new Mobility for Everyone Everywhere in North Carolina grant. Just a little background on this grant. This is a rural transportation grant from the US DOT. We asked for 20 million and they came back and said, we'll give you half of that, which we'll take anything that we can get. So we were happy to have that to set things up. But this really was focusing on the capital side of setting up the transit agencies for microtransit. So looking at turnkey as a service or purchasing software. And because it was really focused on that more than the operation side, North Carolina, we actually were able to secure a 50-50 match to this, utilizing state funds to help facilitate the operations of these agencies. So as part of this grant, 11 communities were all brought together. 9 of them were setting up new microtransit, and 2 of them were expanding their existing, including Wilson and Wilmington were both expanding their existing service as part of this grant. We're currently working with these services, taking those lessons learned that we had from these other ones, these other services, and making sure that as these all get set up and running at the same time, that they're getting that level of attention that's required for being successful. Next slide will show you a map of these. It's similar to the last one, just having a little bit more clarity. As you can see, these are rural agencies. Even the Wave Transit down here in Wilmington, we're focusing on the rural aspect, so expanding the existing service out to the more rural communities surrounding it. And then you see CARTS, which is a 4-county system up in the north side of the state. It's one of the most rural and economically depressed areas in North Carolina. So really balancing the different contextually sensitive criteria and variables is a huge part of what we're doing with Me&C. Next slide. Just to show that this program's ambitious, we got the grant back in 2022. It took a while to work with USDOT on exactly what this looks like because it's been very different. So it took a couple of years to really flesh out what our PGA was going to be, our grant agreement. But since the beginning of this year, we've been able to move forward and get everything obligated towards the end of last year and really focus on the implementation side of things. We have our first ribbon cutting coming up at the end of this month, which we're really excited about. But all of our systems are on track to be fully operational by the end of this summer this year. So we're extremely excited about the work that's happening. Every single one of these agencies is very different, but that's part of what makes it exciting to get these up and running. Next slide. So just to come back full circle on this, as we go through each one of these agencies, and I'll be happy to talk more in depth about any of the particulars if there's any questions there. But these are the main points that we're driving home with these agencies, making sure that we're talking about what funding looks like once these 3 years of operational funds run out, making sure that you're prepping for that. And we're here to help as the state agency, encouraging and requiring it as part of the contract for the grant to own your own data, making sure that you have the right level of support. We have a great team of both internal DOT staff and consultants that are really helping push everything moving forward and making sure that this is something that's beneficial to our citizens in North Carolina. And a big part of what we're finalizing on a lot of these is fare determination. And a lot of that has been going to the communities and asking them what's going to work or what's not going to work. And should everybody be getting the same fare or should it be needs-based? All of these are things that we're evaluating and going through this. And I think the other thing that's coming out of this is we're putting money in this next year, state funds, to do a follow through research program with our ITRI, which is the Institute of Transportation Research and Education. That's here at NC State. They're going to be following the program implementation and talking to us about ridership modal changes. Are we changing the way that people are moving with this microtransit system? But also talking about fare evaluations. We've had a couple of our transit agencies that run microtransit have to increase their fares. And one of the interesting things with that is the increased fares was less indicative of reduction of ridership than having to change the service hours. So service hours were a higher priority than fares were in a lot of these. Now that was a change from like $1.50 a ride to $2 a ride. So that may not impact as much if they had double or triple the ridership. But what we really want to do is make sure that we're utilizing this project and the data that's collected from this project to really help build out that framework that can be used in North Carolina and across the country when they're talking about microtransit in rural agencies. So I think with that, Happy to answer any questions, and here's my contact information for anything that I can't answer while we're on the call today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both, Brennan and Tiffany. Great presentations. Again, summaries of both of those, along with the slideshows, will be distributed out to you all after the workshop. So if you missed a slide or anything, don't worry about that. So we have about 10 minutes, maybe a little under, for Q&A. Again, a number of you have been dropping questions in the chat, and we'll get to those as we can. So I just want to start it off with a question for both of you. So often in microtransit, we're seeing sort of a different set of vendors than those who transit agencies are maybe used to working with. More of kind of the Silicon Valley venture capital influence there. Definitely a different pace of things, pace of contracting. What are some tips that you can give, or just sort of observations you may have that could help agencies navigate working with sort of this new breed of private vendors? Brennan, I think this also gets a little bit into the data ownership point that you were talking about. So if you could address why that, you think that's a key point here, that would be great.
Yeah, I can start on that. And the first thing I'll say is getting statewide contracts for software is very hard. And then making sure it caters to all your needs, both on rural sides and microtransit and new technologies is even harder, I feel. We took 2.5 years to get a statewide software contract in place, and a lot of what that was really our internal networks, our internal DIT, not quite getting that we were putting together a software package that other people could buy off. We weren't operating it ourselves, and the concept is hard to get through. So we've actually seen a lot of success, and one of the good things about me and C having the 10 agencies go at one time is we were able to use a lead agency procurement method, and had one of those agencies really go out and put that RFI with our technical assistance on. We need somebody who's got a proven track record in microtransit, understands that rural agencies need to be able to split their fares up, whether it's a medical ride or an elderly and disabled ride, or all of these different things. And what we did with that was we made sure that all the vendors that applied or responded to us had the demonstration where we talked through those points. And we haven't found the perfect one. We found ones that work differently in different areas. And I think it's going to continue the demand is going to make some of these vendors change their applications or their understandings of things that are outside of the more typical urban environments.
So I will echo that Virginia is still trying to navigate how we could start a state contract in general. I mean, right now we only have for our bus vehicle procurement, but it is a challenge for us actually, because we have a lot of our microtransit services were independently or individually procured, and they all had leaned to one. And so I'm actually struggling to fight the optics that we aren't encouraging more, and that we just don't have a, single source procurement with this vendor that is operating microtransit. The other part is that it is a challenge to be able to understand just technology and transit procurement and dealing with vendors who can do a lot of here's packages and not really understand that they really only need X and what needs to go into the actual procurement. So we are taking some efforts in terms of just general procurement templates. So whether that's looking at RFIs or RFPs, what the contract may look like, also maybe providing some on-call consultant assistance when we just don't have the capacity. So just to kind of answer that. But I know there are some questions in the chat that kind of asked about why we haven't pursued a state level contract. And it's just because, one, the timing of having a number of different agencies or even one lead agency to do the procurement for us, since we can't do it ourselves for the same reasons that Brennan mentioned about educating some of our other departments in the state on what we're trying to do. But then two is just the kind of the bandwidth of, having the time and resources to pull together and then do the actual interview and procurement and negotiate. That is definitely something that is time consuming. So hopefully we'll get there.
So the need for a lot of capacity building in kind of all directions,
Yeah.
both to the local agencies and elsewhere in the state government. So Marcy had a question about scaling and sort of, I think one of the things about microtransit generally is what happens to the cost if it gets very popular. How can states plan for these things? And I think this also kind of segues into the question about pilot versus long-term program funding, especially since a lot of these projects are just now getting past the pilot phase. So either one of you want to take on scaling, Tiffany?
Yeah, I'll try to do this succinctly because that's like a very loaded multi-point question there. So in terms of like evaluating where we're seeing with the cost, it really is a matter of managing scale. So for our rural agencies, we've had a struggle of trying to make sure that they aren't encroaching on what I would just typically call demand response versus microtransit. I have to remind, and Brennan did a great job of putting a common definition of microtransit, but it's kind of the term has been used in different capacities. So what that has meant in terms of just kind of managing that cost when we have these deployments is that sometimes they grow too big too fast. And then therefore they sacrifice a little bit about the travel time and then the cost per passenger, the cost per revenue mile, how they're documenting that in terms of data, it sometimes becomes more expensive than when they're doing fixed route because demand increases faster than they can actually address the riders or the trips. In terms of long-term sustainability, I know I talked about it, but there, after we have so many years of state funding, we have had a struggle, and we're looking at this currently, is that if you go so many years of only having to contribute X amount locally, how do you help our agencies begin that conversation of kind of weaning off of state or any kind of federal funding and really thinking about that local investment? And so sometimes that's what we thought, that if you were given 2 or 3 years, that you would have enough data and that you would be able to build the case and build the buy-in from your localities. That's also been a case with our General 5311 with capital and operating, where there's only so much of local funds that it almost is pitched as, you don't have to basically pay anything. And so it's been almost to a detriment of long-term sustainability that they don't plan for enough local investment, that they find themselves at a cliff in a lot of situations. And that's even exacerbated when they go fare free. So I will leave it at that in terms of my point.
Yeah,
give about 1 minute.
Yeah, I echo that. I think one of the things we're doing with our research is we're trying to understand what the best metric is. So is it cost per hour? Is it cost per person? Is it cost per mile? How are you comparing this? We've also started to see a lot of government excitement about turnkey in our last Senate budget that passed this last week, we actually saw discretionary our state funds come for microtransit. So we're continuing to evaluate how much is it going to cost for us to do microtransit in North Carolina with all of these agencies and put that forward into our state budget and give it to legislators who are currently excited about it. But that's a dangerous game. It's sometimes on a whim, as we all know.
So thank you for that. There were a lot of great questions also about, I don't think we're gonna have time to address, about, especially about coordination across municipalities, fare setting, commingling paratransit and microtransit passengers. These are great questions. And I would love if we had time to address them. Unfortunately, I don't think we do. But you know how to get in touch with the folks on who presented here today. So I just want to thank everybody for attending. Thanks to AASHTO, and thanks again to Tiffany and Brennan. So as I said, we'll be writing this up, sharing a summary out to everybody that'll have everybody's contact info in it. So if you have additional questions, the Shared Use Mobility Center can also be a resource on a lot of these. We have a lot of case studies and things in our Mobility Learning Center and resources we can connect you with. So please feel free to reach out. So I will hand it back to Rebecca, and thanks again, everybody.
I will just second that. Thanks right at the end here. I hope that everyone, if you have questions, the speakers have given their contact information. You're welcome to reach out to them. You can also reach out to Colin or me if there was something about the presentations that you wanted to follow up on. We will be sending out the presentation resources post this meeting, so keep an eye out for the recording, which will be available to the state DOT registrants specifically. The discussion summary, which will be available to everyone and also publicly posted on the SUMC website. The presentations will also be emailed out to registrants. And if this sort of general subject matter is relevant to your work or something you're very interested in, AASHTO does have the intercommittee working group on shared mobility, mobility on demand, and mobility as a service, where we quarterly meet online to talk about these different topics and matters. It's driven by state DOT interest. Our next meeting of this working group is on June 12th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern. You can email me if you would like that link. If you're on AASHTO's communication rosters, you will get the invitation if you haven't already. So please stay tuned there. And one more time, don't hesitate to reach out to either of us if you have any questions or would like to follow up on anything. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, for the four-part webinar series we've been doing with SUMC. It's been a pleasure to hear from everyone and to work with SUMC on this series.